Today we'll be taking a look at Divinity, Original Sin 2 on the Potato Masher and Potato Masher Pro. In case you don't know, the Potato Masher is a series where I compare a cheap PC against the PS4. There's also the Potato Masher Pro, which competes against the PS4 Pro and now the Xbox One X. The goal isn't to pick on consoles, but to compare and contrast the platforms to show you what's possible with a budget PC. For these shorter videos called Tater Tots, I just review the game on the PCs themselves. Links are in the description if you want more information about either Potato Masher, and let's get to it. On the GTX 760 in the Potato Masher, Divinity Original Sin 2 generally runs well considering the age of the GPU. At 1080p, very high settings, and locked at 30 FPS, there were very rare drops during large special effects like ice and fire. These were never more than a frame or two and not noticeable without a frame rate counter, so they didn't really affect the gameplay. This is a game that doesn't have many downsides to playing at 30 FPS with the exception of panning across the in-game view. The built-in motion blur doesn't appear to be that effective, and this can lead to some noticeable jittering and fast pans. It's minor, but if that's the type of thing that bothers you, you should know that it's there. Other than that, I'd recommend locking at 30 FPS on budget hardware so you can enjoy the highest level effects. Divinity isn't necessarily a beautiful game, but it has a cartoonish art style that's easy to follow but still allows for features like ambient occlusion and lighting effects. I actually really like how it looks. The Masher does have trouble with 1080p and 60 FPS, even at medium settings. The GPU can get maxed out by a lot of elemental effects like you can see here with this fire. While this drop down to the 30s is the worst I've seen, there are very frequent drops into the high 40s or low 50s. This is sometimes because of the GPU, but it's very frequently because of the CPU, at least in large towns or busy areas. Divinity appears to be optimized around 2 CPU cores, which is a bit low for most modern games, and these cores can get maxed out fairly easily. If you have a variable refresh rate screen, or you aren't bothered by some drops, the higher frame rate is nice. But in my opinion, it's not worth it on this particular hardware configuration. If you want a real upgrade to the graphics, the Masher can run the game at 1440p, very high settings, and 30 FPS. So same setup as 1080p and 30 FPS, just 70% more resolution. This gets you noticeably sharper characters and models, and it runs just as well as the game does at 1080p. Even if you only have a 1080p screen, it's worth it for the super sampling to clean up the image. The Masher can kinda play the game at 4K in low settings, but it looks very dated and the frame rate drops into the 20s constantly. It's not really practical to game at 4K on the Masher anymore, so this isn't a surprise. But now let's check out how the Masher Pro runs the game. Swapping the Masher's GTX 760 for the Masher Pro's GTX 1060, we're just about doubling the available GPU power, and it quickly shows. While the Masher was capable of maxing out the game's settings at 1080p, the Masher Pro can do it at 60 FPS as well. Because of the somewhat shaky CPU optimization, you'll still see drops all the way into the 30s at particularly stressful times, but most of the time the game is humming along between 55 and 60 FPS. The same is true at 1440p and medium settings. The Masher Pro is solidly at 60 FPS during simpler sections of the game, but as soon as the CPU gets stressed, the frame rate drops by 5 to 30 FPS depending on the situation. You could always lock at 30 and not worry about it, but it's at 60 often enough and long enough that I do think it's worth trying. At 4K, I didn't bother trying for 60 FPS. That would necessitate lowering the visuals enough that the game starts to suffer visually, and considering the art style, the added sharpness of 4K isn't enough to offset the reduction in visuals. However, at 4K, high settings, and 30 FPS, the game looks great. You can more easily appreciate the fine detail in character models and armor, or the gently waving ferns and trees that decorate the game world. Aliasing shimmer is almost entirely gone at this resolution, and while I'm admittedly biased towards 4K in most cases, I think this is the best way to play the game on the Masher Pro. A fantastic RPG with a lot of attention to the art style, Divinity Original Sin 2 is good on both the Masher and the Masher Pro. The CPU optimization is a little disappointing, but the game does scale down well to much slower systems, which is typical of many PC-first titles. My personal rig has a 4790K and never drops below 60 FPS, so it's not a hard target to hit for more powerful hardware. I think the game will hold up just fine at 30 FPS for most people if 60 FPS isn't an option. The game is well worth playing regardless. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel or supporting me on Patreon if you enjoy my content. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.